Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the latest political turmoil in Nepal, which has again threatened to affect Indian interests in the Himalayan region. See, the landlocked state of Nepal has witnessed a lot of political turmoil and political volatility through the 1980s to till date, and these adverse internal political developments of Nepal tends to directly affect Indian interests in the region. See, for many decades, Nepal was a monarchy. It was also a theological state which had officially adopted Hinduism as its religion, and by the time it transitioned into a constitutional republic and into a democratic secular state, Nepal had already witnessed long periods of instability, beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1980s, the Madhesi community of the Terai belt of Nepal frequently protested against the Nepali political elite as the community felt discriminated, and this led to several clashes and frequent blockades along the India Nepal border. Because the Madhesi community found along the Terai belt shares a close Indian connection as well in the border villages of UP and Bihar, and to exert pressure on the Nepali political elite and for demanding equal rights, the Madhesis had blockaded the India Nepal roads, which eventually led to the crippling of Nepal's economy. These developments of the 1980s obviously affected Indian interests, as the well being of the Madhesi community was under threat, and as the Madhesis share a close familial connection on the Indian side, the Indian government was worried about their well being. But at the same time, India's close relations with the Nepali government was affected because the Nepali government alleged that India was responsible for these blockades and that India was instigating the Madhesis along the border areas to block the roads. So essentially, despite sharing close relations, India and Nepal have constantly had these issues, wherein the internal political developments of Nepal and its internal political crisis has a direct impact on Indian interests. Then came the decade of 1990s when Nepal descended into a brutal civil war, when the Nepali Maoists took up an armed struggle against the government of Nepal and its armed forces. As Nepal descended into this civil war, India had reasons to believe that China could be sponsoring the Maoists in order to gain influence in Nepal and to cut Indian influence in the country. This period of instability also dragged India into the conflict, and eventually, India ended up mediating the conflict between the Maoists and the Nepali government by working out the 12-point peace agreement, which brought the civil war to an end. Following the end of the civil war, Nepal made a complete transition from being a theological monarchy to constitutional democratic republic, which was a secular state. And with this, India played a key role in Nepal's political transition. And in 2008, Nepal's Constituent Assembly was set up to draft its new constitution. But just when India was hoping that Nepal's political crisis was ending, new troubles began within Nepal, and the constitution drafting process got dragged for years together due to the demand of the Madhesis that they should be provided with equitable representation under the new constitution, and due to their demand for greater federalism in the Terai Plains, which was opposed by the Nepali political elite. So this standoff within the Constituent Assembly delayed the constitution drafting process for 7 years. And during this entire period of crisis, many governments came and went in Nepal, and prime ministers and presidents kept changing. And all the while, India was getting accused of interfering in Nepal's internal affairs and for trying to manipulate the constitution drafting process in favor of the Madhesi community. These constant allegations of India's involvement in its internal affairs led to the rise of anti India sentiments in Nepal, which ended up compromising Indian interests in the country. Then finally, in 2015, Nepal adopted a new constitution. But as this constitution did not respect the demands of the Madhesis, India expressed its unhappiness over the new constitution. But eventually, India came around to accept the Nepal's constitution, and under this, fresh elections were held in 2017. With this, India was finally hoping for some political stability in the country, but the election of KP Oli as Nepal's prime minister ruined India's plans, as he turned out to be a ultra nationalist leader who sustained his campaign based on strong anti India sentiments. And after coming to power, he even took several controversial decisions which were deemed to be pro China and anti India, thereby again leading to the compromise of Indian interests in Nepal. Then, as KP Oli started facing internal problems with his coalition government, he deliberately chose to step up anti India sentiments and whip up nationalist feelings by exploiting the dormant border dispute between India and Nepal. See, the border disputes at Kala Pani and as well as at Susta, they are a relic of the colonial era, and these minor border disputes date back to the 1816 treaty, which was signed between the then British India government and the Kingdom of Nepal. This treaty was the Treaty of Sugauli, signed after the end of the Anglo-Nepal War, which ended up drawing the boundaries between British India and the Kingdom of Nepal. Post-independence, India inherited these boundaries from the British, and these boundaries, as outlined in the Treaty of Sugauli, became the boundaries between India and Nepal. But at the Kalapani region, which is located at the tri-junction of India, Nepal, and China, the Treaty of Sugauli made use of the Kali River to draw the boundaries. But the different interpretation of the alignment of the Kali River has led to conflicting claims between India and Nepal over the sovereignty and jurisdiction of Kalapani. Today, Kalapani happens to be a part of the Pithoragarh district of Uttarakhand, located close to the strategic Lipu Lake Pass, which not only connects India with Tibet and serves as an important military point, but it also offers a route for the Kailash Manas Sarovar Yatra pilgrimage. For many decades, these dormant disputes at Kalapani and as well as at Susta were never blown out of proportion due to the mutual agreement between the two countries. At Susta as well, located on the borders of Bihar, the Gandak River was used as a reference by the 1816 treaty, that is the Treaty of Sugauli, to mark the boundaries between British India and the Kingdom of Nepal. But today, the Gandak River, also known as the Narayani River, has changed course, and this shifting alignment of the Gandak River has contradicted the boundary alignment which was laid out under the 1816 treaty, thus leading to this minor border dispute at Susta. But for several decades, both the issues were kept on the back burner, and both the governments were not exaggerating these disputes out of proportion. In fact, in the 1980s, they had even set up a joint working group to work out the technical parameters for resolving these minor boundary disputes. But in 2019, after India published a new political map to take into account the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir, Nepal's Prime Minister KP Oli deliberately exploited the issue, and even though India's new maps did not alter the claims on the ground, KP Oli chose to add fuel to the border dispute in order to distract attention away from the internal crisis that Nepali government was dealing with. In order to strengthen his hold over power, and in order to overcome the internal political crisis, he chose to aggravate the border dispute with India, and this highlights how Nepal's political instability always affects Indian interests. Last year in 2020, India's defense minister inaugurated a critical road that connects Darchula with the Lipu Lake Pass in order to facilitate the Kailash Manas Sarovar Yatra. After this road was inaugurated by India, KP Oli again stepped up the controversy surrounding this border dispute, and this time he chose to increase Nepal's claims as well, thereby leading to a major diplomatic crisis with India. So, for the last 1.5 to 2 years, India Nepal relationship has suffered as a result of these border disputes, which have been exaggerated by KP Oli. And now again, Nepal's Prime Minister has triggered a new political crisis by colluding with the president and has managed to get the Nepali parliament suspended in order to further strengthen his hold over the government. And by getting the lower house dissolved, he has pushed Nepal towards fresh elections, thereby perpetuating a prolonged internal political crisis in the country. So, the underlying point of the writer is that every time there is political instability in Nepal, it somehow compromises Indian interests. And hence, he's calling upon India to proactively engage with all the political actors, including all the political parties, because that is the only way forward for India to protect its interests without being seen as partisan or biased towards any party. Now, let's take up a column from page number 7, in which the writer evaluates the GST structure along with the nature of the relationship between the central government and the state governments with regard to the implementation of the GST. See, in 2017, India introduced a major taxation reform known as the GST or the Goods and Services Tax, which radically transformed the indirect taxation system in the country. Its implementation was based on the 101st Constitutional Amendment Act, which was enacted by the Parliament in 2016. This constitutional amendment introduced a new era in indirect taxation in the country, and it provided for the unification and integration of all the different types of indirect taxes that existed. It was said that the GST would be a panacea for India's stifled economic growth, and this indirect taxation system was believed to deliver enormous economic efficiency. It was expected to increase tax buoyancy, thereby raising tax revenue for the governments, and boost GDP growth and widen the tax base, thereby ushering the transformation of the Indian economy into a formal economy. To implement this indirect taxation system and to take the key decisions, the GST Council was set up through this amendment, and it inserted Article 279A, which has provided constitutional status to the GST Council. See, the GST Council was supposed to function as the apex body for GST related decisions, and its main objective was to promote cooperation and coordination between the central government and the state governments. This council is headed by the Union Finance Minister with representation from the state governments, and its key objective has been to promote the spirit of cooperative federalism, that is, to promote cooperation between the center and the states, along with promoting consensus amongst the center and the states in order to iron out the implementation of the GST. This key institution was expected to meet once in every quarter, and it was designed to promote center state cooperation in the spirit of India's federalism. But however, the writer is of the opinion the GST has had several shortcomings, and he points out that its faulty implementation has eroded the trust between the central government and the state governments as a result of center's unilateralism in framing key economic policies and in taking key economic decisions that have a direct bearing on the state's finances. For example, last year's imposition of a sudden lockdown to deal with the pandemic without consulting with the state governments regarding its impact. Then the convenient shifting of the burden and the responsibility by the center towards the state governments with regard to vaccination strategy and with regard to increased COVID management responsibilities, which has significantly increased the COVID management cost for the state governments. Without adequate financial or policy support, the center has shifted the responsibility towards the states, thereby significantly increasing their expenditure, and this has placed the finances of several states under severe stress. Then, upon this, when the GST model was implemented, it was anticipated that the state governments would be losing their fiscal autonomy, and hence they would be losing a large part of their revenue. And in turn, to compensate them for this loss of revenue and for this loss of fiscal autonomy, the center was mandated to guarantee a certain revenue to the states by undertaking periodic transfers of the GST collection. But as the writer points out, the center has unilaterally altered its commitments under this revenue sharing model, thereby increasing the financial burden on the states, and this has largely left the state governments at the mercy of the center. Apart from this, the center has taken several key decisions, including the adoption of the new farm laws without having any consultation with the state governments. And by citing such examples, the writer points out that such display of unilateralism by the center is against the spirit of cooperative federalism, and it erodes the trust and the trustworthiness that the states have placed on the center. See, according to the trust game theory developed by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, it has been postulated under behavioral economics as to how the economy will perform when two heterogeneous participants are taking part in an economy. When two different entities, such as the state governments and the center, are participating in an economy, the nature and character of the behavior of the state governments and the center has a direct impact on the economic outcomes. And accordingly, under the trust game model, Daniel Kahneman had proved that if the participants in the economy are displaying altruism towards each other, that is selflessness towards each other, then it would translate to mutual benefits to all the parties, resulting in overall economic growth. But at the same time, if the behavior of the participants towards each other is filled with spite and revenge, then it would force the economy to underperform as a result of the prevailing hostile political environment. And the writer says that, in the current Indian context, the political relations between the center and the states is filled with spite, hatred, and revenge. And this political incompatibility and hostility towards each other, primarily driven by the unilateral policies of the center, has eroded the trust and the trustworthiness factor that the states were supposed to place on the center. In such a political setup, where the states no longer trust the center, unified taxation policies such as the GST are bound to fail due to the several problems that emerge during implementation. The writer remarks that even the 15th Finance Commission has acknowledged in its report that the GST implementation has been a big failure which has compromised India's economic growth, and this failure and shortcomings have been attributed to its faulty implementation by the center. The writer specifically pinpoints the complexities involved in the GST structure, including the prevalence of multiple rate structures, high tax slabs, and complicated tax filing processes. So these flaws in implementation, accompanied with the unilateral policies of the center, which erodes cooperative federalism, and the failure of the center to fulfill its commitment on revenue guarantee to the states, have combined together to create a situation where the states no longer trust the center, especially the states which are ruled by the opposition parties. Hence, to fix these shortcomings in the GST, the writer calls upon the center to first fulfill its revenue guarantee by proactively transferring the GST collections, and he proposes an extension to the revenue guarantee for another 5 years, which currently has been capped at 2022. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which evaluates the national mission on cultural mapping. See, India is often acclaimed for its rich cultural diversity, but despite this, it is quite shocking that the budget of the Ministry of Culture happens to be extremely low. The writer points out that the budgetary allocation for the Ministry of Culture has declined over the last 5 years, and today it stands at just 0.07% of the total budget. The ministry's total budget for the financial year 2021-22 stands at just 2,688 crore rupees, and this is for a ministry that is responsible for running several academies, art galleries, and centers of cultural excellence. Compared to India, countries around the world, they invest heavily in protection and promotion of their cultural assets, but India is seen to be lagging behind despite its rich cultural diversity. So, in order to fix these shortcomings and to make a beginning towards cultural reforms, the ministry had proposed the creation of a cultural map for the country, and accordingly, in 2015, the National Mission on Cultural Mapping was launched. Under this mission, a national database was supposed to be created, which would map out the cultural assets of the country based on art forms that are popular in a particular geography, including the details of artists available at a certain location, along with the details of related institutions which are involved in the promotion of those art forms. So, this comprehensive cultural map was supposed to become a critical resource in the hands of the ministry, which would help in transforming the art and cultural landscape of the country. To fund this cultural mapping initiative, a budget of 3,000 crore rupees was supposed to be set aside. But despite making the right beginning, the project did not take off until a few years. And in fact, until 2017, the mission was not even officially approved. In the last 2 to 3 years, meager allocations have been made to this cultural mapping initiative. But this is no match or no comparison to the cultural initiatives that have been taken up by European cities and by European countries. The writer points out that such a cultural map, if prepared, could be a vital tool in the hands of policymakers to help the country emerge as a leading cultural hub of the world. Such a database containing the country's cultural map, along with the easy to use portal, will enable art and culture enthusiasts to find the right resources and support for their art form, and it could become a key element in the revival of the country's cultural tag. But unfortunately, the national mission on cultural mapping has lost its track over the last few years, largely due to the meager budget that has been allotted, and hence the writer calls for a policy shift to revive the cultural mapping project, which could help India emerge as a cultural leader. Next, on page number 1, 8, and 9, we have a series of articles related to the ongoing standoff between WhatsApp and the Government of India. See, a few months ago in February, the Government of India notified the new IT rules of 2021. These new IT rules have brought in place an intermediary guidelines and digital media ethics code, which applies for social media firms, digital media, and OTT platforms. As per these guidelines, social media firms have been asked by the government to help the government authorities identify the first originator of any message or any information on their platforms based on the receipt of any relevant government orders or court orders. Basically, if the government demands a social media firm to help trace the originator of a message, then these firms will have to comply with the government orders or the court orders. And this controversial provision has brought social media firms into a direct standoff with the Government of India. Over these IT rules, social media firms like WhatsApp have taken the Government of India to court, and they have challenged the constitutionality of these new IT rules. The argument of WhatsApp is that if they are forced to help the government authorities identify the originator of messages, then it would constitute a violation of the data security and data privacy of the users of these social media platforms, along with the imposition of curbs on the fundamental right to free speech and expression. See, both these rights are guaranteed fundamental rights under the Indian Constitution. Article 19 guarantees free speech and expression, whereas the Supreme Court interpreted in the landmark Puttaswamy case that right to life guaranteed under Article 21 also covers right to privacy, and on these grounds, WhatsApp has tried to shield itself from the new IT rules. The implementation of these rules would mean that social media firms such as WhatsApp, they will have to break their end-to-end encryption and help the government authorities trace the originator of messages by providing for such a verifiable mechanism. The government, on the other hand, has defended its argument by stating that such provisions are essential to protect the country's national security and to maintain law and order, because inflammatory messages on the social media has the potential to threaten national security and law and order. In its argument, the government has reminded WhatsApp and has informed the court that right to privacy under Article 21 and right to free speech and expression under Article 19, they are not absolute fundamental rights. They come with reasonable restrictions. And as per the government, the grounds of national security and maintenance of law and order serve as reasonable restrictions. And in this interest, social media firms are bound to help out government authorities to trace the originators of messages. The fear of social media firms in this ongoing controversy is that these provisions could be misused by the government to target its users and violate their fundamental rights, leading to the stifling of dissent and opposition, and even possibly enabling mass state surveillance against the citizens. Now let's take up another article from page number 13. Bangladesh has approved a currency swap arrangement for Sri Lanka. See, over the last few years, Sri Lanka has been facing a massive debt burden, and as it has been unable to repay its loans, it has also been staring at a foreign exchange crisis. Along with this heavy debt burden, the Sri Lankan economy has taken a major hit as a result of the pandemic because its key export sectors, such as garments and tea, have taken a huge hit, and as well as tourism, which is another major source of foreign exchange and revenue to the Sri Lankan government, has also suffered immensely as a result of the pandemic. So, due to this economic crisis that Sri Lanka is staring at, the country has approached several other countries in the region seeking a currency swap arrangement which helps the recipient country to overcome the debt burden by swapping its currency for enabling the loan repayment. Recently, Sri Lanka had sought currency swap support from China and China approved a currency swap arrangement of around $1.5 billion. This is in addition to the $500 million loan that Sri Lanka has taken from China, along with the extra $500 million extended last year by China. Apart from this, Sri Lanka has even sought support from South Korea, and the Exim Bank of South Korea has worked out a $500 million loan arrangement. On similar lines, Sri Lanka had even approached India for support, and recently India had approved a currency swap arrangement of $400 million through the RBI. These currency swap arrangements helps the recipient country to overcome an immediate foreign exchange crisis, and at a later convenient date, it can repay those currency swaps. So based on Sri Lanka's request, India had approved a currency swap arrangement of $400 million. But upon this, the Sri Lankan government had requested for an additional $1.1 billion currency swap support from India. The Indian government, however, was yet to respond on this request, and this decision has been pending on the Indian side since last year. So, in the middle of this, Bangladesh has become the first South Asian country this year to provide financial support to Sri Lanka in the form of a currency swap arrangement. Now, let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: frequent political turmoil in Nepal has often compromised Indian interests. In the light of the latest political crisis, examine the way forward for India. A fundamental problem in the GST is the erosion of trust between the states and the center. Critically evaluate. This would be your second question. So kindly write your answers to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.